The unexpected defendant. The courtroom of Prescott County buzzed with murmurs as people filtered in, filling the gallery to capacity. Today was no ordinary day. Whispers of intrigue and curiosity rippled through the crowd. At the center of it all stood 19-year-old Malcolm James, a wiry young man with sharp features and a quiet, thoughtful demeanor. His second-hand suit was a size too large, its sleeves barely grazing his wrists. Despite his unassuming appearance, Malcolm's presence demanded attention. He stood at the defense table alone, clutching a worn folder filled with papers, his knuckles pale from the grip. Across the room, the prosecution attorney, a seasoned veteran named Victor Hargrove, watched him with a bemused smile. This would be a short and straightforward case, or so he thought. At the bench sat Judge Meredith Caldwell, known for her sharp wit and even sharper judgments. Her reputation as a no-nonsense arbiter preceded her, and her courtroom was a place of precision and order. She peered over her glasses at Malcolm, her skepticism evident. "Mr. James," she began, her voice firm but measured, "you are aware that representing oneself in court is highly inadvisable, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Malcolm replied, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I understand." The faint sound of chuckles from the gallery wasn't lost on him, nor was the slight smirk that played at the corners of Judge Caldwell's lips. "Young man," she continued, "this court has little patience for theatrics or unprepared defenses. Are you certain you wish to proceed without counsel?" Malcolm straightened his posture, holding her gaze. "I'm certain, Your Honor." Her eyebrows arched briefly in surprise, but she nodded. "Very well. Let's proceed." The case appeared simple on the surface, a minor traffic violation. Malcolm was contesting a citation for reckless driving, issued after he allegedly ran a red light and nearly caused an accident. The evidence against him included a traffic camera recording, eyewitness testimony, and the officer's report. On paper, the odds were stacked against him. As the prosecution presented its case, Malcolm listened intently, jotting notes on a small pad. Hargrove, confident in his arguments, laid out the evidence with practiced ease. "Your Honor," Hargrove concluded, "the defendant's actions on that day were not only illegal but dangerous. The evidence speaks for itself. This case is open and shut." Judge Caldwell turned to Malcolm. "Mr. James, do you wish to cross-examine the witness or present your defense?" Malcolm stood, adjusting his tie. His heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained composed. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to begin my defense." The gallery stirred as Malcolm walked to the evidence table. He took a deep breath and held up a small stack of papers. "Your Honor, the prosecution has made a compelling argument. However, there are several key inconsistencies in the evidence that I'd like to address." The courtroom fell silent. Malcolm's voice, though calm, carried a quiet authority that demanded attention. "First," he began, "the traffic camera footage presented by the prosecution is incomplete. While it shows my car approaching the intersection, it does not capture the full sequence of events leading up to the alleged violation." He approached the evidence display and pointed to a timestamp on the video. "Here, Your Honor, the footage begins at 14:03:27, but the traffic signal report indicates that the light changed from yellow to red at 14:03:23. This discrepancy suggests that critical seconds of context are missing." Judge Caldwell leaned forward, her interest piqued. "And what do you believe this missing context would reveal, Mr. James?" Malcolm hesitated briefly, ensuring his next words were precise. "I believe it would show that I entered the intersection while the light was still yellow, not red as the prosecution claims." The gallery erupted into murmurs. Even Hargrove shifted in his seat, his confidence momentarily shaken. "Order." Judge Caldwell's gavel silenced the room. She gestured for Malcolm to continue. "Second," Malcolm said, his voice gaining strength, "I'd like to challenge the reliability of the eyewitness testimony. The witness, Ms. Green, stated that she saw my vehicle from her car, which was stopped at a gas station adjacent to the intersection. However, he unfolded a hand-drawn diagram of the intersection and placed it on the evidence table. It was meticulous, with measurements and sightlines clearly marked. Based on the position of the gas station and the angle of her car, it would have been impossible for Ms. Green to see the traffic signal from where she was parked. Her view was obstructed by this building. He pointed to a shaded area on the diagram. Judge Caldwell studied the diagram, her expression thoughtful. "Where did you obtain this information, Mr. James?" "I visited the site, Your Honor," Malcolm replied. "I measured the distances and took photographs, which I've included in my evidence packet." He handed the photos to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. She examined them closely, her skepticism giving way to curiosity. And finally, Malcolm said, turning to the officer's report, "I'd like to address the calibration of the radar gun used to determine my speed. The report states that my speed was 47 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour zone. However, the calibration certificate for the radar gun is missing from the evidence. Without this certificate, the accuracy of the reading cannot be verified." Hargrove stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Radar calibration is standard procedure." "Standard procedure," Malcolm interjected respectfully, "does not equate to admissible evidence. The law requires documented proof, not assumptions." Judge Caldwell raised a hand, signaling for Hargrove to sit. Her gaze returned to Malcolm, her expression now one of genuine interest. "Mr. James," she said, "you seem to have a remarkable understanding of legal processes for someone representing themselves. Where did you learn this?" Malcolm hesitated, then spoke with quiet confidence. "I've been studying law since I was 14, Your Honor. It's always been my passion." The room fell silent. Even the judge seemed momentarily speechless. Malcolm continued, his voice steady. "Your Honor, my goal here is not to outwit the prosecution or discredit anyone. I simply want the truth to be considered. The evidence presented against me is incomplete, inconsistent, and unreliable. Based on these facts, I respectfully request that the charges be dismissed." He returned to his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the table. The weight of the room pressed on him, but he held his head high. Judge Caldwell leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze fixed on Malcolm. "This court will take a brief recess to review the evidence. We will reconvene in 20 minutes." As the gavel struck, the gallery erupted into hushed whispers. Malcolm remained seated, his expression calm, but his mind racing. He knew this was only the beginning. Outside the courtroom, the world was already beginning to take notice. Reporters gathered, cameras ready, as whispers of the young man's surprising defense began to spread. But for Malcolm James, this was more than a case. It was a chance to prove that resilience, preparation, and determination could overcome even the strongest odds. The rising storm. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The whispers and muffled laughter that had greeted Malcolm James at the beginning of the hearing were gone, replaced by a tense curiosity. The gallery sat on edge, their eyes fixed on the young man who had unexpectedly commanded the room. Judge Caldwell returned to her seat, her expression unreadable but her movements deliberate. She adjusted her glasses and tapped her pen lightly on the desk, a habit that often signaled deep contemplation. Opposite Malcolm, the seasoned prosecutor Victor Hargrove shuffled his papers, his earlier confidence now tempered with a flicker of unease. "Mr. James," Judge Caldwell began, addressing Malcolm directly, "the court acknowledges your observations regarding the evidence. Before proceeding, I must ask, do you wish to submit additional evidence or testimony?" Malcolm stood slowly, his every movement measured. He adjusted his oversized jacket and approached the bench, holding a small stack of neatly organized documents. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady. "I'd like to submit additional evidence to clarify the inaccuracies I pointed out earlier." The courtroom fell silent as Malcolm unfolded another diagram of the intersection where the alleged violation occurred. This one was even more detailed than the first, incorporating precise measurements, traffic flow patterns, and a timeline of events. Your Honor, he began, pointing to the diagram. The prosecution claims that I ran a red light and nearly caused an accident. However, after reviewing the traffic signal sequencing and analyzing the officer's positioning, I've reconstructed the exact sequence of events. He walked over to the evidence table and carefully laid out his findings. This is the official signal timing report from the city's Department of Transportation, which I obtained last week. It shows that the light at this intersection remains yellow for 4.2 seconds before turning red. Based on the distance from the stop line to where my car was located when the light changed, it would have been physically impossible for me to clear the intersection if I had been speeding as alleged. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, her interest growing. And what is the basis for this calculation, Mr. James? I used basic physics, Your Honor, Malcolm said, his tone calm and unpretentious. I calculated the deceleration required for a vehicle traveling at the alleged speed to come to a complete stop. The officer's report states that my car was moving at 47 miles per hour, but the brake marks measured at the scene indicate a much lower speed, closer to 38 miles per hour. A murmur rippled through the gallery, and even Hargrove seemed momentarily stunned. The prosecutor quickly stood, his voice firm but tinged with frustration. Your Honor, this is absurd. The defense is using technical jargon to distract from the core facts of the case. Malcolm turned to face Hargrove directly, his expression respectful but unyielding. With all due respect, Your Honor, the facts of the case rely on accurate evidence. If the evidence is flawed, the conclusions drawn from it are equally flawed. Judge Caldwell rapped her gavel once, silencing the gallery. Mr. James, continue. Malcolm nodded and gestured to another document. This is a sworn affidavit from a licensed traffic engineer who reviewed my findings. It confirms that the angle of the officer's radar gun and the surrounding environment, specifically the presence of a metal utility pole, could have caused interference, resulting in an inaccurate speed reading. The judge scanned the affidavit, her eyes narrowing slightly. And how did you manage to secure such an affidavit? I reached out to the engineer after noticing the potential interference during my site visit. Your Honor, Malcolm explained, I wanted to ensure my analysis was thorough and unbiased. Hargrove's frustration was palpable. He stood again, addressing the judge with a tone of controlled irritation. Your Honor, the defense is presenting speculative theories. This case is about the defendant's reckless behavior, not a scientific debate. Judge Caldwell held up a hand, silencing the prosecutor. Mr. Hargrove, the court will determine the relevance of the evidence presented. Sit down. The gallery buzzed with excitement as Hargrove reluctantly returned to his seat. Malcolm continued, his confidence growing with each passing moment. Finally, Your Honor, he said, holding up a photo, I'd like to address the credibility of the eyewitness testimony. This is a photograph taken from the exact position where Ms. Green claims to have seen the incident. As you can see, her line of sight was obstructed by a delivery truck parked at the gas station. He handed the photo to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Judge Caldwell examined it closely, her expression inscrutable. Mr. James, she said after a long pause, your argument is compelling, but the prosecution has yet to respond. Mr. Hargrove, do you have a rebuttal? Hargrove stood, his frustration now mingled with a hint of desperation. Your Honor, the defense's arguments are speculative at best. The traffic camera footage clearly shows the defendant's car in the intersection during a red light. Malcolm turned to face the prosecutor once more, his tone respectful but firm. Your Honor, the footage shows my car in the intersection, but it does not prove when I entered it. The missing seconds in the footage are critical, and without them, the prosecution cannot establish beyond a reasonable doubt that I committed the alleged violation. Judge Caldwell nodded slowly, her gaze shifting between Malcolm and Hargrove. The defense has raised significant questions about the reliability of the evidence. This court will need time to review these new submissions. She looked directly at Malcolm, her tone softer than before. Mr. James, your preparation and attention to detail are commendable. This court will recess until tomorrow morning to allow for a thorough examination of the evidence. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck, and the room erupted into whispers and hushed conversations. Malcolm gathered his papers, his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. He avoided the curious stares of the gallery as he made his way to the exit, his mind racing. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters held microphones aloft, their cameras aimed at the young man who had just stunned the courtroom. Malcolm hesitated on the steps, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "Malcolm James," a reporter called out, "what inspired you to represent yourself today? Do you think you'll win this case?" Another shouted. Malcolm raised a hand, signaling for quiet. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying over the commotion. "I'm just here to ensure the truth is heard. This case isn't about winning or losing. It's about fairness." His response only fueled the media frenzy. As he stepped away from the crowd, his phone buzzed with messages from friends, family, and even strangers who had heard about the case. Among them was a text from his mother, a simple but powerful message. "I'm so proud of you." That evening, Malcolm sat alone at the kitchen table in his modest apartment. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of papers as he reviewed his notes. Despite the whirlwind of the day, his focus remained unwavering. He glanced at a framed photo on the counter, a picture of him as a child, sitting on his late father's lap. His father had always encouraged him to pursue his dreams, no matter the obstacles. "You have a sharp mind, Malcolm," his father used to say. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As he prepared for the next day in court, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or judged unfairly. And he wasn't done yet. The weight of expectations. Morning came with an electric tension that seemed to hum through the air outside Prescott County Courthouse. By the time Malcolm James arrived, a small crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps, comprised of reporters, curious onlookers, and community members who had been captivated by the young man's remarkable performance the day before. Malcolm stepped out of the bus, his suit freshly pressed, though his shoes still bore the scuffs of years of wear. He carried the same worn folder of documents, but now it seemed less like a symbol of inexperience and more like a badge of his determination. His steps were measured as he walked up the courthouse steps, his chin high despite the weight of countless eyes fixed on him. Inside the courthouse, the energy was palpable. Courtroom 3A was already filling to capacity, and an overflow room had been set up for those unable to find seats. Malcolm entered the room to a chorus of whispers, the crowd parting slightly as he made his way to the defense table. Judge Meredith Caldwell was already seated at the bench, her sharp gaze following his every move. The opposing counsel, Victor Hargrove, was reviewing his notes, his expression grim. He looked up briefly, his eyes meeting Malcolm's, and offered a tight-lipped smile that betrayed his unease. Today, Hargrove was no longer dealing with an amateur. He was facing a formidable adversary. As the gavel struck, signaling the start of the proceedings, Judge Caldwell addressed the court. "Before we proceed, I would like to remind everyone that this is a courtroom, not a theater. Decorum will be maintained at all times. Mr. James, are you ready to continue your defense?" Malcolm stood, his hand steady despite the weight of the moment. "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well," the judge said, gesturing for him to proceed. Malcolm took a deep breath and approached the evidence table once more. Today, he carried not only his documents but also a small projector he had borrowed from a community center. The clerk helped him set it up, and soon an image of the intersection appeared on the courtroom's projection screen. "Your Honor," Malcolm began, "yesterday I presented evidence that questioned the reliability of the prosecution's claims. Today I'd like to expand on that by providing a more comprehensive analysis of the traffic camera footage." He clicked a remote, and the video began to play. The footage showed Malcolm's car approaching the intersection, but as he had pointed out the day before, the critical seconds leading up to the alleged violation were missing. I analyzed the footage frame by frame, Malcolm continued, and I noticed something unusual. If you look closely at the timestamp here, he paused the video. You'll see a faint distortion in the image. This suggests that the camera may have experienced a technical error during recording, which could explain the missing frames. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Even Judge Caldwell leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "How did you identify this distortion, Mr. James?" the judge asked. "I cross-referenced the footage with other recordings from the same camera on different days," Malcolm explained. "The distortion is not present in those recordings, indicating that it was a one-time occurrence." Hargrove stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is pure speculation. The defense has no proof that the missing frames would exonerate him." Malcolm turned to Hargrove, his tone respectful but firm. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. If the evidence they've presented is incomplete, then it cannot be used to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." Judge Caldwell raised a hand, silencing Hargrove. "Mr. James, continue." Malcolm nodded and advanced the slide to display a second image. This one showed a detailed map of the area surrounding the intersection, with arrows indicating traffic flow and sightlines. "Next, I'd like to address the officer's report," he said. "The officer claimed that he observed my car enter the intersection while the light was red. However, based on the officer's position, marked here on the map, it would have been impossible for him to have a clear view of the traffic signal. His line of sight was obstructed by a billboard on the northeast corner of the intersection." He handed a printed copy of the map to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Judge Caldwell studied it carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Where did you obtain this map, Mr. James?" she asked. "I created it myself, Your Honor," Malcolm replied. "I used publicly available data and measurements I took during my site visit." The gallery buzzed with admiration. Malcolm's meticulous preparation was becoming impossible to ignore. The prosecution's frustration was mounting, and Hargrove's voice rose slightly as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defense is presenting a series of hypotheticals. The evidence is circumstantial at best." Malcolm responded calmly. "Hypotheticals are not my intention, Your Honor. My goal is to highlight the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. If their evidence cannot withstand scrutiny, then it cannot be considered reliable." Judge Caldwell nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on Hargrove. "Mr. Hargrove, the defense has raised valid points. Do you have a response?" Hargrove hesitated, his confidence visibly shaken. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to review the defense's submissions." The judge's lips curved into a faint smile. "Request denied, Counselor. The court expects you to proceed." The day wore on, with Malcolm continuing to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. He called into question the officer's training, the calibration of the radar gun, and the reliability of the eyewitness testimony. Each point was supported by meticulous research and carefully prepared evidence. By the time Malcolm delivered his closing argument, the courtroom was spellbound. His voice was calm, but carried a quiet intensity that filled the room. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not just about a traffic violation. It's about ensuring that justice is applied fairly and without prejudice. The prosecution's case relies on assumptions, incomplete evidence, and unreliable testimony. If we allow these flaws to go unchallenged, we undermine the very foundation of our legal system." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking for fairness. And I believe that fairness requires the dismissal of these charges." As he returned to his seat, the gallery erupted into applause, only to be silenced by Judge Caldwell's gavel. "This court will take another recess to deliberate," the judge announced. "We will reconvene shortly." As Malcolm stepped out of the courtroom, the crowd outside surged toward him, their questions blending into a cacophony of voices. But Malcolm barely noticed. His focus remained on the case, the evidence, and the hope that he had done enough to sway the court. He glanced up at the sky, his heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Win or lose, Malcolm knew one thing for certain. He had given it everything he had. And no matter the outcome, he had already proven to himself, and to everyone watching, that he belonged in that courtroom. A ripple through the system. When the court reconvened after the recess, the tension in the air was almost tangible. The crowd had swelled, with more people gathered outside the courthouse, hanging on every word from reporters streaming updates. Inside, in courtroom 3A, every seat was filled, and the overflow room buzzed with anticipation. Malcolm James sat at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Though outwardly composed, his mind churned with a mix of anxiety and determination. Across from him, Victor Hargrove furiously scribbled notes, his previously calm demeanor replaced by a thinly veiled frustration. Judge Meredith Caldwell took her seat at the bench, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Malcolm. "This court is now back in session," she announced, striking her gavel. "Before we proceed to closing statements, I've reviewed the evidence and arguments presented thus far. Mr. Hargrove, do you wish to respond to the defense's claims?" Hargrove stood, smoothing his tie as he approached the bench. "Yes, Your Honor. While the defense has presented an admirable argument, I maintain that the evidence against Mr. James is both sufficient and compelling." He gestured to the projector, where a paused frame of the traffic camera footage remained on the screen. The traffic camera clearly shows the defendant's car in the intersection after the light turned red. The radar reading confirms that he was speeding, and the officer's testimony corroborates these facts. Malcolm listened intently, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. He could feel the weight of every word Hargrove spoke, the prosecutor's voice carrying the authority of years of experience. Hargrove turned to face the gallery, his tone growing more impassioned. "This case is not about technicalities or speculative interpretations. It's about holding individuals accountable for their actions. To dismiss this case would set a dangerous precedent." Judge Caldwell nodded, her face giving little away. "Mr. James, do you have a rebuttal?" Malcolm rose, buttoning his jacket as he approached the podium. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "the prosecution has argued that the evidence against me is compelling. But compelling is not the same as conclusive. The law requires that guilt be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and in this case, that standard has not been met." He turned to the projection screen, clicking to a new slide. This one displayed a side-by-side comparison of the radar reading and the officer's report. The radar reading states that I was traveling at 47 miles per hour, but the officer's report describes my speed as visibly excessive, a subjective observation that does not align with the radar's precision. This inconsistency calls into question the reliability of both pieces of evidence. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Furthermore, the traffic camera footage, while compelling, lacks the critical seconds needed to establish when I entered the intersection. Without those frames, the prosecution's argument is incomplete. Hargrove's frustration was evident, but he remained silent, his jaw tight as Malcolm continued. As Malcolm walked the court through his final points, his tone grew more impassioned. He spoke not just as a defendant, but as someone deeply invested in the integrity of the system itself. "Your Honor," he said, turning to Judge Caldwell, "this case is not just about me. It's about ensuring that the law is applied fairly and without bias. Every piece of evidence must be scrutinized, every assumption challenged, to ensure that justice is not merely a word but a practice." The gallery erupted into whispers once again, only to be silenced by the sharp crack of the judge's gavel. "Thank you, Mr. James," Judge Caldwell said, her tone softer than it had been earlier in the trial. "This court will now deliberate. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gavel struck again, and the room buzzed with energy as people filed out, eager to discuss the day's events. Malcolm remained seated for a moment, his hands resting on the table. He had done everything he could. Now, it was out of his hands. As Malcolm exited the courthouse, the scene outside was chaotic. Reporters swarmed the steps, their questions flying faster than he could process. "Mr. James, how do you feel about your chances?" one reporter asked, thrusting a microphone toward him. "Do you think the judge will rule in your favor?" another shouted. Malcolm raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "I trust in the process," he said simply. "Whatever the outcome, I'm proud of the case I've presented." His calm demeanor only added to the growing fascination with his story. By the time he reached the sidewalk, his phone was buzzing non-stop with messages and notifications. Friends, family, and strangers alike had reached out, offering support and encouragement. That evening, Malcolm returned to his modest apartment, exhausted but unable to sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of notes and evidence. His mind raced with thoughts of what he could have said, points he might have missed. Despite his growing confidence, the weight of the trial pressed heavily on him. His mother, Clara James, called just as he was about to close his eyes for a brief rest. Her voice was warm and full of pride. "Malcolm, I've been watching the news," she said. "You're doing something incredible. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already made a difference." Her words brought a small smile to his face. "Thanks, Mom. I just hope I'd done enough." "You've done more than enough," she replied firmly. "Now get some rest. You'll need your strength." The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the courthouse early, the weight of the previous day still heavy on his shoulders. As he entered the courtroom, he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The gallery was even more packed than before, with new faces among the crowd. When Judge Caldwell took her seat, the room fell silent. She surveyed the courtroom for a moment before speaking. "This court has reviewed the evidence and arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense," she began. "Before I deliver my ruling, I would like to commend Mr. James for his thorough preparation and articulate presentation. Regardless of the outcome, your dedication to justice has not gone unnoticed." Malcolm felt a surge of hope, but forced himself to remain composed. "The law is clear," the judge continued. "In order to convict, the prosecution must prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. After careful consideration, this court finds that the evidence presented does not meet that standard. The charges against Mr. James are hereby dismissed." The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into applause. Malcolm sat back in his chair, the weight of the decision washing over him. He had done it. As he stepped outside, the crowd greeted him with cheers and applause. Reporters clamored for his attention, but Malcolm's focus remained on the moment. The realization that he had not only defended himself, but had also sparked a conversation far beyond the walls of the courthouse. That day, Malcolm James became more than just a defendant. He became a symbol of resilience, determination, and the power of standing up for what is right. And though his battle in court was over, he knew that his journey was just beginning. Beyond the verdict, the energy outside the courthouse was electric as Malcolm James emerged victorious. Reporters clamored for his attention, cameras flashed, and the crowd buzzed with excitement. Malcolm paused at the top of the steps, taking in the surreal scene. He had never imagined his traffic case would become a spectacle, let alone one with national attention. A reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "Malcolm, how does it feel to win against such overwhelming odds?" Malcolm adjusted his tie, his calm demeanor belying the storm of emotions within him. "This case was never about winning," he said, his voice steady. "It was about fairness, about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, gets a fair chance to defend themselves." The crowd erupted into cheers. As Malcolm descended the courthouse steps, a young boy pushed through the crowd, clutching a notepad and pen. "Mr. James," the boy called out, his voice breaking slightly with excitement. "Can I have your autograph? I want to be a lawyer like you someday." Malcolm crouched down to the boy's level, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Of course," he said, signing the notepad with a flourish. "But remember, being a lawyer isn't just about winning cases. It's about fighting for what's right." The boy nodded earnestly, clutching the notepad to his chest as if it were a treasure. Malcolm straightened and made his way to the waiting car, ignoring the persistent questions of reporters. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but for the moment, he needed silence to process everything. That evening, Malcolm sat in his apartment, staring at the framed photo of his father on the mantel. His father had been a community advocate, always fighting for the underprivileged and voiceless. Malcolm had grown up watching him work tirelessly to bring about change, even when it seemed impossible. "You'd be proud of me today, Dad," Malcolm murmured. "I did it. I proved them wrong." His reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. He opened it to find his best friend, Jaden, holding a pizza box and a six-pack of soda. "Victory celebration," Jaden declared, grinning. "Thought you might need some company." Malcolm chuckled and stepped aside to let Jaden in. They sat at the kitchen table, the pizza untouched as Jaden peppered Malcolm with questions. "Man, you've got to tell me," Jaden said, leaning forward. "How did you stay so calm in there? Everyone was watching you like a hawk." Malcolm shrugged. "I just focused on the facts. It wasn't about me. It was about the case." Jaden smirked, humble as ever. "But you know this is just the beginning, right? People are already talking about you like you're some kind of legal prodigy." Malcolm's expression grew serious. "It's not about being a prodigy, Jaden. It's about proving that justice can work if you're willing to fight for it. I just hope my story inspires others to believe that." Over the next few days, Malcolm's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. News outlets covered his case extensively, dubbing him the self-made defender. His phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, some congratulating him, others offering job opportunities or interviews. One call stood out. It came from Professor Helen Cartwright, a renowned legal scholar and dean of a prestigious law school. "Mr. James," she said, her voice warm but professional, "I've been following your case closely. Your performance in court was nothing short of extraordinary. I'd like to extend an invitation for you to speak at our upcoming legal symposium." Malcolm hesitated. "I appreciate the offer, Professor Cartwright, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak at a symposium." "Nonsense," she replied firmly. "Your story is precisely what aspiring lawyers need to hear. It's not just about knowledge. It's about resilience, preparation, and courage. Please consider it." After a moment's thought, Malcolm agreed. "I'd be honored, Professor." The symposium was held in a grand auditorium, its stage lit by soft spotlights. Malcolm stood behind the podium, his heart pounding as he faced an audience of legal professionals, students, and community leaders. "I never imagined I'd be standing here," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "A few weeks ago, I was just a young man fighting a traffic case, trying to prove my innocence. But what I learned through that experience is something I'll carry with me forever." He paused, scanning the room. "The law is a powerful tool, but it's only as strong as the people who wield it. Too often, we let assumptions and biases cloud our judgment. My case wasn't just about a speeding ticket. It was about challenging those assumptions and proving that everyone deserves a fair shot." The audience listened intently, their expressions a mix of admiration and reflection. "Each of us has the ability to make a difference," Malcolm continued. "Whether it's in a courtroom, a classroom, or our own communities, we can all fight for justice. But it starts with believing in ourselves and refusing to back down, no matter how high the odds seem." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Malcolm stepped away from the podium, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. After the symposium, Malcolm was approached by a young woman in a crisp blazer. "Mr. James," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Anna Carter, an attorney with the Equal Justice Initiative. Your story is incredible, and your dedication to fairness is exactly what we look for in our team. Have you considered pursuing a career in law?" Malcolm shook her hand, a thoughtful expression on his face. I've always wanted to make a difference. If that path leads me to law, I'd be open to it." Anna smiled. "Here's my card. When you're ready to take the next step, give me a call." As the days turned into weeks, Malcolm found himself at the center of a growing movement. His case sparked conversations about justice, bias, and the importance of challenging assumptions. Community leaders invited him to speak at events, law schools offered him scholarships, and advocacy groups sought his input on their initiatives. But through it all, Malcolm remained grounded. He spent his evenings volunteering at community centers, mentoring young people who reminded him of himself. One evening, a teenage boy approached him after a workshop. "Mr. James," the boy said shyly, "how did you know you could do it? How did you know you wouldn't fail?" Malcolm knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I was scared, just like anyone else. But I trusted myself. I prepared, I worked hard, and I didn't let fear stop me. And you can do the same." The boy nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. As Malcolm walked home that night, he thought about how far he'd come. His fight in the courtroom had been just the beginning. Now he was fighting for something bigger, a chance to inspire others, to create change, and to ensure that justice was not just a concept, but a reality for everyone. And though his journey was far from over, Malcolm knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever came next, a legacy in motion. Months after Malcolm James's courtroom triumph, the ripple effects of his victory continued to expand. His story had moved far beyond the confines of Prescott County, inspiring people across the nation and beyond. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #FairnessFirst and #DeafenedLikeMalcolm, and communities began hosting discussions on systemic bias and the power of perseverance. For Malcolm, the whirlwind of attention had been both rewarding and overwhelming. Opportunities flooded in, from job offers at prestigious law firms to speaking engagements at universities. Yet Malcolm remained grounded, choosing to channel his newfound platform into meaningful action. One crisp morning, Malcolm found himself standing in front of the Prescott County Juvenile Detention Center. He adjusted his tie and glanced down at the folder in his hand, its contents meticulously organized as always. Today was a new chapter in his journey, a chance to give back to those who needed it most. Inside, a group of teenagers sat in a small, brightly lit room. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to skepticism as Malcolm entered. He set his folder on the podium and looked around the room, his calm gaze meeting each pair of eyes. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and warm. "My name is Malcolm James. A few months ago, I was sitting in a courtroom, fighting to prove my innocence. Today, I'm here to help you find your voice and fight for your futures." The room grew quiet, the skepticism in some of the teens' faces giving way to interest. Malcolm continued, sharing his story, not just the legal battle, but the struggles he had faced growing up, the doubts he had overcome, and the belief in himself that had carried him through. After the session, one of the boys approached him, a tall, lanky teenager with a nervous energy. "Mr. James," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you really think someone like me can make it? I've messed up too many times." Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're not defined by your mistakes," he said firmly. "What matters is what you do next. If you're willing to work hard and believe in yourself, you can achieve more than you think." The boy nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. As Malcolm left the center that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was where he belonged, using his story to uplift others and show them what was possible. In the following months, Malcolm's influence grew. He partnered with community organizations to launch a mentorship program aimed at helping young people navigate the legal system and pursue their goals. The program, called Pathways to Justice, provided workshops, resources, and one-on-one guidance to those who often felt voiceless in the face of adversity. The program quickly gained traction, drawing attention from national organizations and prominent figures. Malcolm was invited to the White House to meet with policymakers and discuss the systemic issues his case had highlighted. Standing in the Oval Office, Malcolm felt the weight of the moment, but he spoke with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through the courtroom. One evening, Malcolm returned to his apartment to find a letter waiting for him. The envelope was embossed with the seal of the Prescott County Court. Inside was a handwritten note from Judge Meredith Caldwell. "Dear Mr. James, I wanted to take a moment to thank you. Your case reminded me of the true purpose of the law, to seek justice and fairness for all, not just those who fit our expectations. You challenged me to look beyond the surface and to reevaluate my own biases. I have no doubt that you will continue to inspire change and make a lasting impact. The courtroom will always have a place for someone like you. Sincerely, Judge Meredith Caldwell." Malcolm read the letter twice, his chest tightening with emotion. To receive such recognition from someone as respected as Judge Caldwell was a testament to how far he had come. Months turned into a year, and Malcolm's life became a blend of advocacy, mentorship, and legal work. He enrolled in law school, determined to formalize his knowledge and gain the credentials to back his natural talent. Despite his growing fame, Malcolm remained approachable, often spending evenings volunteering at community centers or speaking at schools. One day, while attending a community event, he was approached by Anna Carter, the attorney from the Equal Justice Initiative, who had offered him a position months earlier. "Malcolm," she said, smiling, "I see you've been busy. Your mentorship program is incredible, but we could really use someone like you on our team. Are you ready to take the next step?" Malcolm thought for a moment before responding. "I appreciate the offer, Anna, and I'd be honored to work with you, but only if it means we can expand the reach of pathways to justice." Anna laughed. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Years later, Malcolm James stood at the podium of a packed auditorium, his name now synonymous with justice and resilience. He had become a prominent civil rights attorney, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves and inspiring countless others to do the same. His victories in court were numerous, but it was the lives he had touched outside of the courtroom that mattered most to him. "Every one of us has a story," he told the audience. "Every one of us has faced challenges that could have held us back. But those challenges don't define us. What defines us is how we rise, how we push forward, and how we use our experiences to make a difference." As the audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the hall, Malcolm felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had been far from easy, but it had brought him to a place where he could create lasting change. And as he left the stage that night, Malcolm knew that his fight for justice was far from over. It was a legacy in motion, one that would inspire generations to come.